All right, so get this, right? Today we are diving deep into, get this, the United Nations.
Hmm.
But, and you know I don't like boring history lessons, right?
Right.
You sent this article, and it looks at the UN through the lens of, wait for it, the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
Like tiny moments, and I mean tiny, had huge ripple effects on how the UN even came to be. Wild, right?
It's pretty amazing when you think about how some, seemingly insignificant choices can have these huge global consequences, right?
Yeah.
And that's what's so cool about this article. It doesn't just focus on the treaties and organizations, but the personalities and decisions that really shape them, you know?
Simply. So, okay, paint me a picture. It's 1945. The world's still kind of messed up after World War II, and everybody just wants peace,
Yeah.
right? Enter the League of Nations.
Right,
Like,
yeah.
they were supposed to be the big peacekeepers, but they totally failed.
They did. And the way the League of Nations was structured was a big part of why it was ineffective. Like, it was founded on this idea of collective security, which sounds great on paper, right? Every member jumps in if another member gets attacked.
Yeah.
But in practice,
Yeah, not so much.
not so much.
Right.
And their voting system, every single member had veto power. So you can imagine how hard it was to actually agree on and then take any kind of meaningful action.
Yeah, I mean, take the Abyssinian crisis, for example. Italy invades Ethiopia, and even though the League condemned the invasion, they didn't do anything. No real action, just words.
Exactly. And everyone learned that lesson the hard way. Words without action don't really mean much. So that brings us up to the UN, right?
Right, like, okay, we tried that League of Nations thing and it blew up in our faces. Now what?
It was a huge do-over moment, but with way, way higher stakes. And you can feel that urgency, that desperation for things to be different this time around in the entire story of the UN.
Yeah, and it wasn't even just about preventing another war.
Right.
It was about tackling, like, the root causes of these conflicts, which is, let's be real, way more ambitious.
Oh, absolutely. The article talks about how the horrors of World War II made it clear that just reacting to aggression wasn't enough. They had to get ahead of it somehow.
Okay, so that's where our big three strut onto the stage. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Each of these guys, and I mean each of them, came with their own baggage and agendas. Roosevelt even coined the term United Nations during the war.
He did. Can you imagine?
Yeah, he was all about that international cooperation.
Roosevelt's a fascinating figure in all of this. He really embodies that post-war hope, a belief in a brighter future. But the article brings up a chilling what if. What if the war had made him cynical like so many others? Would we even have the UN as we know it today?
This is a really good question. Makes you think about how much really was riding on the mindsets of a few individuals at that time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you've got hopeful Roosevelt. Then there's Churchill, the pragmatist of the group. I mean, he was laser focused on preventing another global conflict.
Yeah.
That was his #1 priority. But here's the thing. The article points out that he actually compromised on some big colonial issues.
Which is huge. Here you have Churchill, this staunch defender of the British Empire, admitting that times were changing, that a new world order was emerging.
Wow.
The article argues that this awareness, this ability to adapt, was absolutely crucial in getting everyone on board with the UN.
So he knew that holding on to the old ways just wasn't going to cut it in a post-war world. Interesting. And then there's Stalin.
Right.
He was all about making sure the Soviets had control in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And that leads us to a concept that's still shaping global politics even today. Veto power.
Oh, yeah. Stalin was not messing around. He was determined to make sure that the Soviets had a say in, well, everything.
Right.
And that meant having the power to block any decisions that didn't fit with their goals.
Yeah.
And that little power move, okay, maybe not so little. That right there is a power dynamic that's still shaping global politics, even today.
It's like having the superpower, right? It can either keep things peaceful or totally bring everything to a screeching halt.
Exactly. And the article makes a really interesting point about that. It says that Stalin's insistence on the Security Council veto was kind of brilliant in a way, but it also created some serious problems.
Okay, I'm listening.
So on the one hand, it prevented the UN from becoming like a puppet of the Western powers, right? But on the other hand, it created a system where any one of those big five could basically hold the entire world hostage to their own interests.
So we've got this brand new global organization, these big dreams for peace, and this veto power thing just hovering over everything.
Yeah.
What happens next? Does the UN actually, work?
Oh, well, the article points to a few early wins that really got people excited, gave them hope. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was a big one.
Oh, right. The idea that everyone is entitled to basic human rights, no matter who you are or where you're from.
Exactly. It was huge. It set a global standard for how governments should treat their citizens. It's something we're still fighting for today, even now.
Wow. 1948.
Yeah.
That feels like both a lifetime ago and just yesterday.
I know, right? But then, boom, reality hits. The Korean War breaks out in 1950, and suddenly, the UN's ability to actually keep the peace is put to the test.
Have that go.
It wasn't pretty. The war dragged on for years, with the US and the Soviet Union backing opposite sides. It exposed the difficulties of trying to maintain peace when you've got these massive superpowers with their own agendas constantly battling for influence.
Yeah, talk about a reality check. It sounds like they were stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to live up to their ideals, but also having to navigate this messy web of global politics.
Exactly. And this is where that veto power we were talking about before comes back into play. Remember how any one of the big five can basically nix a resolution?
Uh-huh.
Now imagine trying to get all five of them to agree on how to handle something as complex and volatile as the Korean War.
Yeah, good luck with that. So who decides when to use this veto power? Is there like a rule book?
It's not quite that straightforward. The veto power only applies to resolutions that go before the Security Council, which is basically the UN's emergency response team. They're the ones who can authorize military action, impose sanctions, all that serious stuff.
High stakes.
You bet. But yeah, having that veto power in the mix makes things incredibly complicated.
It has to.
Right. It creates this constant tension between wanting to step in and prevent atrocities and humanitarian disasters, but also not wanting to overstep or, God forbid, get sucked into another global conflict. It's a tough balancing act, and often the UN ends up being criticized no matter what they do.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. And the article really drives home this point. If they take action, they're accused of being a puppet of these powerful nations, and if they do nothing, they're seen as weak and ineffective. So where does that leave them?
It's a no-win situation, it sounds like.
Yeah. It often feels that way. And the article argues that this is where we bump up against the fundamental question about the UN's effectiveness. Can an organization created by governments, each with their own interests and agendas, really achieve something as complex and multifaceted as world peace? I mean, can they?
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? They've got these incredible, lofty goals, but the system itself seems like it's almost designed to prevent them from achieving them.
Yeah.
So where does that leave the UN today? I mean, it's still around. It's got to be doing something right.
Oh, absolutely. And it's had to evolve a lot since those early days. Think about it. The world in 2024 is a completely different place than it was back in 1945. The Cold War, history, new global powers everywhere. And don't even get me started on climate change. Nobody even had that on their radar back then.
It's like the UN has had to learn to adapt just to survive.
Adapt or die, right. And adapt it has. The article talks about how the UN has actually become a major player in a bunch of global issues. Take, for example, their work on fighting poverty and promoting sustainable development.
Right.
The Millennium Development Goals, and now the Sustainable Development Goals, have provided a framework for global cooperation on some of the biggest challenges facing humanity.
So it's not just about keeping the peace anymore. It's about tackling the root causes of conflict, like they talked about back in 45.
Exactly. And let's not forget about their work on human rights. I mean, you've got the International Criminal Court, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. These are things that simply didn't exist before the UN.
It's like they've become this global watchdog, making sure countries are treating their people right.
Yeah, in a sense. But let's not forget, the UN is a product of the very states that created it. So there's always this tension, this power struggle going on behind the scenes.
Right, back to the whole, can a group of governments actually create world peace dilemma?
Exactly. And that's what I think is so interesting about this article. It leaves us with this really big, thought-provoking question. Is the UN, with its current structure, really equipped to deal with the realities of the 21st century?
That's a big question. I don't even know where to start with that.
Well, the article doesn't pretend to have all the answers, and maybe that's okay. It acknowledges the UN's flaws, the bureaucracy, the gridlock in the Security Council, the fact that it relies on states to fund it. But it also points out those times when the UN has made a real difference, when it's truly lived up to its promises.
It's kind of like at some point you realize the UN isn't this thing's separate from us. It's a reflection of us, humanity trying to figure out how to get along and build a better world.
You nailed it. And that's what's so great about this deep dive, don't you think? We start off talking about the butterfly effect, how small choices can snowball into these massive global events, and somehow we end up wrestling with some of the biggest questions facing humanity.
And we don't get any easy answers, do we? The article makes us think critically about the UN, about its role in the world, and about our own role in shaping the future.
Exactly. The future of the UN isn't just up to politicians and diplomats, it's on all of us. The choices we make, the actions we take, it all adds up, right? It's that butterfly effect in action.
Wow, a lot to think about. From butterflies to the world stage, who knew the story of the UN was this complicated, fascinating, and honestly a little bit hopeful. A huge thank you to our listener for sending in this article. This is a conversation I won't forget anytime soon.
Me neither. And for everyone listening, we want to hear your take on all of this. What do you think the UN's role should be in the 21st century? Head over to our social media and let us know what you think. Until next time, happy diving.